Think you'd enjoy a medieval peasant's dinner. Picture hearty stews, fresh bread, maybe some roasted meat? Yeah, no. The reality of peasant dining circa 1300 would make a prison cafeteria look like a five-star restaurant. We're talking meals that were 90% grain, 10% whatever didn't kill you yesterday, and 100% guaranteed to give you digestive issues that would last longer than most marriages. If you love history, weird stories, and questionable food choices, welcome to Food Storic. Hit subscribe before the dysentery hits. Let me paint you a picture. It's dawn in medieval England. You're a peasant. You wake up on your straw mattress, which doubles as home to several species of insects. Your stomach is growling because dinner last night was bread. Breakfast this morning, also bread. But wait, it gets better. This isn't your artisanal sourdough from Whole Foods. This is bread that could double as a weapon. Dense, dark, and made from whatever grain didn't get taxed by your lord. Rye, barley, oats all ground together with a healthy dose of dirt and the occasional pebble. Your teeth didn't last long in the Middle Ages, and now you know why. The average medieval peasant consumed about 2 pounds of bread per day. That's roughly 3,000 calories just from bread. Sounds excessive until you realize they were burning 5,000 calories a day doing backbreaking manual labor. No gym membership needed when you're plowing fields by hand for 14 hours. The bread wasn't just food, it was fuel. Dark, heavy, and about as appetizing as edible concrete. But here's where it gets weird. That bread, it was often your currency too. Bakers were paid in bread. Workers received bread as wages. You could literally pay your taxes in bread. Imagine rolling up to the IRS with a trunk full of Wonder Bread. They'd probably prefer that to what medieval tax collectors got, which was mostly moldy loaves and creative excuses. Now you're probably thinking surely they had something to go with the bread. You're right, they did. Ale, not water ale. Because water would kill you faster than the plague. Every stream was basically an open sewer. Every well was contaminated with something. If you drank water in medieval times, you were either very brave, very stupid, or very dead. Usually all three. So ale it was. For breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Even children drank ale. Weak ale, but still ale. The average peasant consumed about a gallon of ale per day. That's 8 pints. By modern standards, everyone was functionally buzzed from sunrise to sunset. Explains a lot about medieval decision-making, honestly. Hey, should we throw suspected witches in the river? Sure, why not? We're all drunk anyway. But wait, you say what about vegetables? Gardens were a thing, right? Oh, sweet summer child. Yes, peasants had gardens. Tiny plots behind their hovels where they grew what they could. Cabbage, onions, leeks, garlic. The most exciting vegetables in the world. Not. These were the survivors, the vegetables that could handle being ignored for weeks while you worked your lord's fields. Forget tomatoes, those were still in America being worshipped by the Aztecs. Forget potatoes, same deal. Your vegetable options were basically anything that grew like a weed and tasted like disappointment. The typical peasant garden was about the size of a modern parking space. From this agricultural powerhouse, you were expected to supplement your bread diet. In summer, you might have some lettuce or herbs. In winter, you had whatever you managed to preserve. Which brings us to the joy of medieval food preservation. No refrigeration meant everything was either salted, dried, pickled, or fermented. Sometimes all four. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Cucumbers, if you were lucky enough to have them, became pickles. Everything else just slowly rotted while you raced to eat it. The smell in a medieval cottage during winter would make a dumpster seem fragrant. Fermented cabbage, slowly rotting turnips, and whatever meat you were trying to smoke without burning down your house. Fabrezi was 700 years away. Speaking of meat, let's address the elephant in the room. Or rather, the complete absence of elephants and most other animals in the peasant diet. Meat was for special occasions. And by special, I mean maybe Christmas if you were lucky. The rest of the year, you were looking at a strictly accidental carnivore situation. Your chicken stops laying eggs. Congratulations, you're having chicken. Your pig breaks its leg. Pork's on the menu, boys. Otherwise, those animals were way too valuable to eat. A chicken that lays eggs is worth more than a single meal. Basic economics, even drunk medieval peasants understood that. When meat did grace the peasant table, it wasn't pretty. We're talking about the parts rich people wouldn't feed their dogs, Organ meats, blood-pudding intestines cleaned and stuffed with grain. Nothing was wasted because waste meant starvation. Your ancestors were out here eating spleen and calling it a feast. Nose-to-tail eating wasn't trendy, it was mandatory. The preparation methods weren't helping either. Everything was boiled. Forever. Until any nutritional value had surrendered and fled. Why? Because fuel was expensive and dangerous. You couldn't just crank up the oven. You had one fire that had to heat your home and cook your food. So into the pot everything went. Grains, vegetables, mystery meat, all swimming together in a perpetual stew that was added to daily and never really cleaned. Some of these pottages, as they were called, had been going for weeks. Just add more water, some grain, whatever you found that day, and keep it bubbling. Food safety was not a concept that existed yet. Also contrary to popular belief, medieval peasants weren't big on spices. You know why? Because spices cost more than gold. Literally. A pound of black pepper could cost as much as a cow. Imagine paying $30,000 for pepper. That's the medieval equivalent. So when Hollywood shows peasants casually sprinkling exotic spices into their stew, I laugh. Then I cry. Then I write angry letters to historical consultants who clearly phoned it in. Salt was the only seasoning most peasants could afford, and even that was regulated. The salt tax was a real thing that started wars. Your seasoning options were salt herbs from your garden and tears of resignation. Mostly the tears. But here's the crazy part. Despite this monumentally terrible diet, medieval peasants weren't necessarily unhealthier than modern people. Different health problems, sure. Malnutrition was common. Vitamin deficiencies were standard. But obesity, basically unknown. Type 2 diabetes, not really a thing. Heart disease? Only if you count getting stabbed in the heart during a dispute over grain rights. The average medieval peasant was actually quite fit. Terrible teeth, sure. Probably some rickets. Definitely some digestive issues. But they were strong, lean, and had endurance that would put marathon runners to shame. Turns out when your job is manual labor and your diet is mostly whole grains, you don't need a gym membership. You also don't need dental insurance because your teeth are gone by 30. But let's focus on the positives. Now let's talk about feast days, because this is where things get interesting. The medieval church, in its infinite wisdom, declared roughly 1/3 of the year as feast days. Days when even peasants were supposed to eat better. The catch? Most of these feast days came with fasting requirements first. Can't feast if you haven't fasted. Medieval logic at its finest. On actual feast days, the manor lord was technically supposed to provide food for his peasants. Key word, technically. What usually happened was peasants got the leftovers from the lord's table. If you've ever gotten excited about leftovers, picture this. These leftovers had been sitting out for hours. No refrigeration, remember? They'd been picked over by the nobility, their servants, their dogs, and probably a few rats. What finally made it to the peasant tables was basically compost with delusions of grandeur. But even terrible leftovers were an upgrade from daily bread. You might get some actual meat that wasn't organ-based. Maybe some white bread, which was like caviar to people used to brown brick bread. If you were very lucky, some fruit that was only slightly fermented. Feast days were basically the medieval equivalent of dumpster diving behind a fancy restaurant. Degrading, sure, but you might find something good. The social hierarchy of food was absolutely brutal. White bread was for the rich, brown bread for peasants. The darker your bread, the lower your status. It was colorism, but for carbs. The rich ate fresh meat, peasants ate preserved meat. The rich had wine, peasants had ale. The rich had individual plates, peasants ate from communal bowls. Nothing says social bonding like sharing a spoon with 12 other people during flu season. Oh, and about those communal bowls. Germ theory wasn't a thing yet. The idea that sharing spit with your entire family might spread disease, revolutionary thinking that wouldn't arrive for another 500 years. Everyone ate from the same bowl, used the same spoon, drank from the same cup. It was basically a petri dish with dinner in it. No wonder life expectancy was 35. Every meal was a game of biological Russian roulette. Fast days were even worse than regular days, if you can imagine. The church banned meat, eggs, dairy, and anything that might bring joy to your life for about 180 days per year. That's half the year of forced veganism, but without any of the good parts of veganism. No avocado toast, no almond milk, no quinoa. Just bread ale, and whatever vegetables hadn't rotted yet. Medieval Catholics were hardcore. Fish was technically allowed on fast days, which sounds great until you realize what medieval fish meant for peasants. Fresh fish. That was for people who lived near water or had money. Peasants in inland areas got preserved fish. Fish that had been dried, salted, or pickled within an inch of its life. Fish that had traveled for weeks on terrible roads, getting funkier by the mile. By the time it reached your average peasant, it was less food, more biological weapon. The smell alone could clear a room. The breakfast situation deserves special mention because it basically didn't exist. Breakfast as a concept was considered weak, morally weak. Only children, the elderly, and the sick ate breakfast. Real adults powered through until midday on nothing but ale and determination. The medieval church actually preached against breakfast. Breaking your fast too early was seen as giving into gluttony, because nothing says gluttony like eating bread before noon. When peasants did eat breakfast, it was leftovers from the night before. Cold pottage, stale bread, maybe some cheese if you were lucky enough to have a cow that survived the winter. All washed down with ale because starting your day sober was apparently not an option. Imagine trying to plow a field on an empty stomach with nothing but weak beer sloshing around. Medieval peasants were tougher than Navy SEALs. Lunch, when it happened, was usually bread and ale. Sensing a pattern, sometimes they'd have some cheese or onions for variety. If it was harvest time, maybe some fresh vegetables. But usually, it was bread ale and whatever you could scavenge while working. The original sad desk lunch, except your desk was a field and your lunch break was 5 minutes between back-breaking labor sessions. Dinner was the main meal, when the term meal is used loosely. This is when the perpetual pottage came out, that bubbling cauldron of whatever was available. New ingredients when in old ingredients never really came out. It was like a very disappointing magic pot. The consistency was somewhere between soup and paste. The taste was somewhere between bland and actively offensive. But it was hot filling and wouldn't kill you immediately, which was all you could ask for. The ingredients list for a typical pottage reads like a medieval grocery list from hell. Barley, oats, rye, whatever grain wasn't moldy. Cabbage, leeks, onions, whatever vegetables weren't completely rotten. Beans, peas, lentils for protein. If you were lucky, some bacon fat for flavor. If you were unlucky, some rancid fat for flavor anyway. All boiled together until individual ingredients gave up and formed a homogeneous gray sludge. Here's where it gets weird, though. This terrible diet might have saved peasant lives during the Black Death. The wealthy ate fresh meat, refined grains, and imported foods. They also died in huge numbers during the plague. Peasants eating their fermented vegetables and whole grains had better gut health. Their terrible diet accidentally gave them better immune systems. It's like finding out the kid who only ate dirt in elementary school never got sick. Disgusting, but effective. Medieval peasants were also accidentally sustainable. Everything was local, because it had to be. Everything was seasonal, because refrigeration didn't exist. Everything was organic, because pesticides weren't invented yet. They were living the farm-to-table dream, except the farm was terrible, and the table was a plank on 2 rocks. Your carbon footprint was 0, because you never went anywhere and owned nothing. The preservation methods were actually kind of genius once you get past the disgusting factor. Fermentation created probiotics before anyone knew what probiotics were. Smoking meat added flavor and preservation. Salt curing could make meat last months. These techniques were born from desperation, but they worked. Sure, your sauerkraut smelled like death, and your pickled fish could strip paint, but you survived winter. Let's talk about dairy, because this is where class differences really showed. Rich people had fresh milk, cheese, and butter. Peasants had whatever dairy products could survive without refrigeration, which wasn't much. Milk went bad in hours, so it became cheese or butter immediately. But making cheese requires salt, which was expensive, and time which peasants didn't have. So most peasant dairy was basically milk in various stages of going off. Yum. Eggs were for the rich unless you owned chickens. But chickens were valuable for their eggs, so eating the chicken was economic suicide. It was the ultimate delayed gratification test. Do you eat your chicken today, or eat eggs for months? Medieval peasants chose eggs, which shows more financial planning than most modern adults. Water deserves its own horror story. Every water source was contaminated with something awful. Wells were too close to latrines. Rivers were full of industrial waste from tanning and dyeing. Streams were where everyone dumped everything. Drinking water was like playing epidemiological roulette. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, pick your poison, literally. This is why everyone drank ale. Brewing killed most of the nasty stuff in water. Alcohol kept it from going bad as quickly. Was everyone slightly drunk all the time? Yes. Did they survive longer than water drinkers? Also yes. Medieval times, the era when being a functional alcoholic was a survival strategy. But here's the thing about medieval ale. It wasn't your craft IPA. This was small ale, maybe 2% alcohol. Thick, cloudy, and more like liquid bread than beer. It had chunks. Beer shouldn't have chunks, but medieval ale did. Or it was nutritious filling and wouldn't give you cholera, so people drank it anyway. Wine was for the wealthy and the clergy. Peasants saw wine at communion, and that was about it. The idea of a peasant having a wine cellar is like imagining a minimum wage worker with a yacht. The social signaling of beverages was intense. Your drink said more about your class than your clothes. Let's talk about sugar, or rather the complete absence of it. Sugar was so expensive, it was kept in locked boxes. The average peasant never tasted refined sugar in their entire life. Sweetness came from fruit when in season honey, if you were brave enough to raid a hive or nothing at all. Medieval desserts for peasants were just slightly less awful versions of regular food. Honey was the only sweetener, and getting it meant fighting bees with medieval technology. No bee suits, no smokers, just desperation and poor decision-making. Many peasants considered honey worth the stings, which tells you everything about how grim the food situation was. When getting attacked by bees is preferable to your daily diet, you know things are bad. Fruit was seasonal and usually went to make alcohol. Apples became cider, pears became perry. Fresh fruit was for immediate consumption or preservation. Nothing was wasted. Apple cores were fed to pigs. Fruit too ugly to eat was fermented. Even the peels were used for flavoring that awful ale. Medieval food storage was a nightmare. No refrigeration, no freezing, no vacuum sealing. You had cellars if you were lucky. Root vegetables could last months in a cool cellar. Everything else was race against time and bacteria. The amount of spoiled food medieval peasants ate would horrify modern health inspectors. But when the choice is slightly rotten vegetables or starvation, you eat the vegetables and hope for the best. Salt was the MVP of preservation, but it was expensive and heavily taxed. The Gabelle tax in France, the salt tax, caused riots and revolutions. Peasants would illegally harvest sea salt or steal it when possible. Getting caught meant fines you couldn't pay or physical punishment. Imagine getting flogged for seasoning your food. Medieval justice was wild. Smoking meat was an art form born from necessity. Every cottage had a smoking setup, usually just meat hanging near the fire. The smoke preserved the meat and added flavor. It also made everything in your house smell like a BBQ joint permanently. Your clothes, your hair, your soul, all smelled like smoke. But hey, your meat lasted through winter, so worth it. Now here's where medieval ingenuity really shined. They figured out you could make almost anything into alcohol. Honey mead, apples cider, pears perry, berries wine. If it had sugar, they fermented it. Not because they were party animals, but because alcohol didn't go bad as quickly as everything else. Medieval peasants were accidentally brilliant at biochemistry. The fishing situation for inland peasants was particularly grim. Fresh fish was impossible. Preserved fish was expensive and disgusting, so they got creative. Fish ponds were dug where possible. Eels were raised in ditches. Yes, eels. In ditches. That's how desperate the protein situation was. Medieval peasants were out here farming danger noodles in sewage ditches and calling it aquaculture. Cooking equipment was basic to non-existent. One pot, one knife, maybe a wooden spoon. That was your kitchen. No measuring cups, no timers, no thermometers. Everything was eyeballed, which explains why medieval recipes are impossible to recreate. A handful of this, a pinch of that. Cook until done, done being a relative term, meaning won't immediately poison you. Fire management was a full-time job. Let it die, and you're eating cold pottage. Let it get too hot and you've burned your only pot and possibly your house. Medieval cooking was extreme sports. Every meal risked third-degree burns or house fires. Gordon Ramsay thinks kitchen work is stressful. Try cooking over an open fire in a wooden house filled with straw. The social aspects of peasant dining were actually quite nice if you ignore the food quality. Families ate together. Communities shared resources. If someone's harvest failed, neighbors helped. It was communal dining born from necessity, but it built strong communities. Everyone was in the same terrible boat, culinarily speaking. Table manners were basic but important. You shared everything, so being greedy was social suicide. Taking more than your share meant someone else went hungry. Medieval peasants had better sharing skills than most toddlers. Probably because, unlike toddlers, they understood that being selfish could mean starvation for someone else. The gender dynamics of food were predictable and depressing. Women did most of the cooking while also doing everything else. Brewing ale, making bread, tending gardens, preserving food, all while raising children and working the fields. Medieval peasant women were basically superheroes, with terrible working conditions and no recognition. Children got the worst of everything food-wise. Smaller portions. Last pick of ingredients. If food was scarce, children and elderly suffered first. Medieval pragmatism was brutal. Working adults got fed first because they brought in food. It's harsh, but when you're one bad harvest from starvation, sentiment is a luxury you can't afford. Now let's bust some medieval food myths. Turkey legs at medieval fairs? Turkeys are from America. Tomatoes in medieval. Stew? Also American. Potatoes? You guessed it, America. Medieval European cuisine was way more limited than Hollywood suggests. No corn, no peppers, no chocolate. The Columbian Exchange hadn't happened yet, so peasants were stuck with what Europe could grow. The spice trade existed, but not for peasants. When spices did appear in peasant food, it was usually because something had gone very wrong for a rich person, like their spice merchant got robbed and peasants found the cargo. Otherwise, spices were for people who could afford to pay more for flavor than food. Medieval portion sizes would shock modern dieters. When food was available, peasants ate massive amounts. We're talking 5,000 calories a day when possible. But remember, they were burning those calories through manual labor. A medieval peasant would look at CrossFit and laugh. Their entire life was CrossFit, but with worse nutrition and no recovery days. The seasonal eating pattern was extreme. Summer and fall meant fresh vegetables and fruit. Winter meant preserved everything. Spring was the starving time when stored food ran out, but new crops hadn't come in yet. Spring was when people ate bark soup. Yes, bark. From trees. Boiled into soup. Rock Bottom has a basement and medieval peasants found it every spring. Food poisoning was just Tuesday in medieval times. No refrigeration meant everything was various stages of spoiled. No understanding of bacteria meant no proper food handling. Peasants had iron stomachs because the weak stomach people died young. Natural selection via nutrition. Darwin would be fascinated. The medical treatment for food poisoning was often worse than the poisoning. Bloodletting for stomach upset. Mercury for digestive issues. Prayer for everything else. The cure rate was approximately 0%. Your best bet was to ride it out and hope your medieval constitution was strong enough. But here's the weirdest part. Some medieval peasant foods are now expensive delicacies. Organ meats are trendy nose-to-tail dining. Fermented vegetables are probiotic superfoods. Whole grain bread is artisanal. Peasants were accidentally ahead of their time, they just didn't know it, because they were too busy trying not to die. The alcohol consumption seems insane until you do the math. A gallon of small ale was maybe 3% alcohol. That's like drinking 32 light beers throughout the day. You'd be hydrated and slightly buzzed, but not wasted. It was the medieval equivalent of microdosing, but for survival, not Silicon Valley productivity hacks. Food riots were common and understandable. When bread prices rose, people rioted. When grain was exported during famines, people rioted. Food was literally life or death. Modern food insecurity is real and terrible. But medieval food insecurity was next level. No safety nets, no food banks, no international aid. Just you, your community, and whatever you could grow or steal. The black market for food was huge. Poaching was punishable by death, but people did it anyway. Stealing a rabbit could get you hanged, but starvation was certain death, so people took their chances. Medieval forest law was basically designed to keep poor people from eating the king's deer. Robin Hood was popular for a reason. Religious dietary restrictions made everything worse. Can't eat meat for half the year. Can't work on holy days, but also can't afford not to work. The medieval church had more food rules than a modern allergy ward. The difference was breaking church food rules meant eternal damnation, not just hives. Food substitutions were creative and horrible. Can't afford meat? Here's blood pudding. Can't afford wheat? Here's bread made from beans. Can't afford anything. Here's soup made from whatever weeds you can find. Medieval cooking was Iron Chef, but everyone loses, and the secret ingredient is desperation. The drink situation for non-alcohol was dire. Water kill you. Milk goes bad immediately. Juice doesn't exist yet. Your beverage options are ale weak wine if you're lucky or nothing. Herbal teas existed, but were medicine, not beverages. Imagine your only drink options being beer or death. Actually, don't imagine it, that was reality. Food prep took forever. No instant anything. Bread took all day to make. Ale took days to brew. Cheese took weeks to age. Everything was slow food before slow food was trendy. Medieval peasants would lose their minds at instant ramen. 3 minutes to food would seem like witchcraft. Feast and famine cycles were brutal. Harvest time meant eating yourself sick because preservation wasn't perfect. Winter meant rationing everything. Spring meant starvation. Summer meant working too hard to eat properly. The medieval diet was like the world's worst intermittent fasting program, designed by someone who hates you. Kitchen safety was non-existent. Open fires, hot pots, no oven mitts. Burns were constant. Add in sharp implements and poor lighting. Medieval cooking was a contact sport. Every meal prep risked injury. Modern kitchen accidents are nothing compared to medieval cooking casualties. The bugs in food situation was acceptance, not avoidance. Weevils in your grain, extra protein. Maggots in your meat. Pick them out and carry on. Flies in everything. That's just life. Modern food safety would seem paranoid to medieval peasants. They'd be amazed we throw food away for having spots. Let me paint the full picture of a typical day's eating. Wake up before dawn. No breakfast because morality. Work for hours on ale fumes. Midday brings bread, onions, maybe cheese ale to wash it down. Work until dark. Dinner is pottage that's been evolving for days. Bread that could double as a weapon. And more ale. Sleep and repeat until you die at 35. Sundays were marginally better. Church meant less work. Sometimes the Lord provided extra food. Maybe you caught a fish legally for once. Sunday dinner might have meat that wasn't organ-based. It was the medieval equivalent of going to a restaurant if the restaurant was terrible, and you had to bring your own spoon. The economics of food meant everything. A bad harvest didn't just mean less food, it meant economic collapse. Peasants paid rent in grain. No grain meant no rent, meant eviction. Medieval farming was high-stakes gambling, where losing meant your family starved. Modern farming stress is real, but medieval farming stress was existential. Regional variations existed, but were minor. Northern peasants ate more oats. Southern peasants ate more wheat. Coastal peasants ate more fish. Mountain peasants ate more cheese. But everyone ate bread, ale, and disappointment. The medieval diet was remarkably consistent in its awfulness across regions. Trade routes brought exotic foods peasants could see, but never taste. Spice merchants would pass through town carrying fortunes in pepper and cinnamon. Peasants would smell them and go back to their unseasoned pottage. It was culinary torture, like living next to a 5-star restaurant, but only being able to afford the dumpster out back. Here's the ultimate irony. Medieval peasants were living the modern health food dream accidentally. Whole grains, fermented foods, seasonal eating, local sourcing, minimal processing. They were paleo, keto, and organic before those were things. They just also had malnutrition, food poisoning, and a life expectancy that would horrify a mayfly. So next time you complain about your lunch, remember medieval peasants. Your sad desk salad is gourmet compared to their pottage. Your overpriced coffee is luxury compared to their small ale. Your worst meal is better than their best feast. We live in a golden age of food, even if it doesn't always feel like it. The medieval peasant diet teaches us about human resilience. These people survived on bread ale and determination. They made it through winters that would break modern humans. They raised families on food we wouldn't feed to pets. They were tougher than we can imagine, and their terrible diet was just one of many hardships they endured. Would you survive on a medieval peasant diet? Probably not. The nutritional deficiencies would get you. The food poisoning would finish you off. The sheer monotony would break your spirit. But medieval peasants didn't have a choice. They adapted, survived, and somehow built the foundation of modern civilization on a diet of bread and stubbornness. The real miracle isn't that they ate this way. It's that they survived it, reproduced, and passed on their genes to us. Every time you eat a sandwich, you're honoring ancestors who would have killed for your lunch. So maybe say thanks to those tough bastards who ate gruel so you could have Uber Eats. Medieval peasant food was terrible by any standard, but it kept people alive through the Dark Ages. It fueled the workers who built cathedrals. It sustained the farmers who cleared forests and created fields. Awful food built civilization. There's something weirdly inspiring about that, even if you wouldn't want to eat any of it. So there you have it, the complete guide to what you ate if you were a medieval peasant. Spoiler alert, it was mostly bread. Everything else was just variations on a theme of survival. Our ancestors were metal as hell eating garbage and building the future anyway. Makes you appreciate that microwave dinner a little more, doesn't it?